etc. I'm now going to ask our speakers to join me at the front of the auditorium here for our panel discussion, and also they're going to be joined by Michelle Broom, Nutrition Manager for the Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council. So if you'd like to come and take a seat at the front, please. And for those of you who are viewing the webcast, thank you very much for submitting your questions. We have some of those coming through as the panel gets organised, but I am going to hand it over to the audience here if there is a question that the audience would like to ask our panel to get us started. Nicole, thank you. All right. Thank you.
For many years, dietitians have been challenged by advice given by naturopaths to our patients about getting rid of wheat. Now, I understand that FODMAPs may be a reason why reducing wheat can provide benefits. But what naturopaths also say is that our wheat is no longer as good for us as it used to be. And I wonder, perhaps David, you're pulling a funny face, you might like to comment on whether there's any foundation that our, largely mass-produced wheat today is actually nutritionally worse off than the wheat used to be.
Well, I don't think there's any systematic information, but modern wheats have got traits in them for production and also for disease, especially rust resistance. So, in the sense, they're much safer than historically. Excuse me. And I just can't think of any evidence that would support that contention. There is this idea, of the noble savage, that things were much better years ago when cholera was rife and all that sort of thing. So I don't think there's any foundation for it whatsoever. Certainly, our information is that the analyses show that nutritional quality is, in terms of protein content and so on, is maintained. There are stringent regulations, or not regulations, there are stringent procedures in place to ensure the adequacy of the macronutrient content. I don't know if you want to comment, Manny.
I haven't got anything else to add other than just confirm what David's already saying. I don't think there's any evidence for any radical change.
Jane, do you have anything to add there?
Well, not really. I think that we also get people presenting who have been to a naturopath and I've taken them off wheat, and they do feel better. And now we think we sort of understand why, but they're not completely better, and there's still grumblings, and so the diet's not quite right. And so we actually then identify the other foods in their diets where the carbohydrates are coming from, and they feel, much better again. So there's definitely something to going off the wheat, but may not be the reason why. You really have to understand why.
Thank you, Jane. I have a question for David. David, if potatoes and rice are cooked and cooled, but then reheated again, does the RS remain, or is RS only present in cool food?
That's quite a complicated question, because the more heating and cooling cycles you put it through, the more RS. But in general, there is retention. Not complete, but in general, there is. So there's more than you would have in a freshly cooked product.
Thank you. You can leave the microphone with Manny. This is a question for you, Manny. What would you classify as a food high in whole grains? I.e., how many grams of whole grain per 100 grams of food would classify as a food high in whole grain?
I don't know that I can answer that question, Robyn, but my understanding is that in terms of a desirable whole grain intake, I think a figure of 48 grams of whole grain has been considered to be an important target, and one could achieve that with three servings of whole grain foods generally. It's not difficult to get that amount, but it's also important to point out that foods like high fibre foods may not be high in whole grain. So something like all bran, for example, is very high in bran, but not necessarily high in grain.
Thank you. And Michelle, your thoughts, and if you perhaps could share some of the work that you're doing at the Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council in terms of helping us understand or define a whole grain food.
Yes. So as Manny mentioned, the the whole grain daily target intake is 48 grams per day, and we are at the moment looking at putting in place a guide for people to help them understand what a source of whole grain is and what a good source of whole grain is in a food. As Manny said, if you had 3 serves of whole grain to each day and each was 16 grams, then that would take you up to your 48 gram target. So that's potentially a good source of whole grain. So we've been doing some consumer research. We're working with food industry to try and come up with some definitions around what is a source of whole grain and what is a good source of whole grain food.
Thanks, Michelle, and I will say that is very much a work in progress for us at this point in time, but watch this space because we hope to have this established very soon. So we have a question for Jane. Thank you. Are digestive problems on the rise as a result of the increased use of artificial sweeteners in the food supply? Example, yogurts and drinks, i.e. diet soft drinks.
Look, I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. I think there's probably more role for gut infection. So often IBS is caused post gastroenteritis, so it's like a post-infective IBS. So anything that disturbs the gut flora could lead to IBS. So really, I don't think there's any evidence about the sweeteners at all.
Thank you. And while you have the microphone, what happens after 6 to 8 weeks on a low FODMAP diet? And what level of tolerance to FODMAPs do you usually find?
Look, we probably need to do more research in this area because we don't, this is just sort of a ballpark figure, we do find people start to feel benefits after really 2 weeks. But because we're wanting to change the nature of the gut flora, we need to be on the diet for longer. That's why it's a bit longer. And also, the 6 to 8 weeks is sort of when you come back for a review to a dietitian. And then at review, we discuss really how people have gone with the diet. And then we start to talk about reintroducing foods. And that's when the re-challenge protocol starts, essentially. So... and it's up to the individual and it's up to the dietitian to really work through that with that particular person because everyone will have their own particular food. And it really does depend on which FODMAP they're malabsorbing. Now, for example, if they are not lactose malabsorbers, we wouldn't have limited milk, but they might be a fructose malabsorber. And so it really has to be individualised with the patient and the dietitian really have to run that.
Thank you. I have a question for each of the panel, I'd like you all to answer this question, and it's on the paleo diet. So the question is, the paleo diet seems to be sweeping across the population at the moment, particularly amongst exercise professionals and personal trainers. What is your response to those pushing evidence from paleo diet which eliminates almost all grains and legumes? So, Manny?
Look, I don't believe that there's anything scientific about looking backwards to learn anything about human physiology, to be perfectly honest. I think it's an interesting story to tell, but I don't think there's really any foundation behind what people used to eat and therefore what they should be eating today.
I'm very keen on history and I can see no basis in fact at all for the paleo diet. People can forget conveniently that they didn't have food storage. The food was often off because there was no food preservation. Knowledge of what people actually consumed is uncertain. Beyond a certain date, you cannot go. If you, for instance, consider the play Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare, it's actually all about the supply of corn from Egypt for Rome. Because people used to eat, the bread circus and the droll was a significant feature of Roman life. But beyond a certain level or a certain period in time, there were no written records. I think the paleo diet is a very pleasant fad. Well, not so pleasant, actually, because some of the recommendations seem to be strange.
Yes, I agree with those comments, and I'd like to add that to really follow a paleo diet, you're looking at about 2 kilos of vegetable matter you'd have to eat a day. And it's around about 100 grams of fibre. Now, I don't think there'd be many people who'd be able to manage that. So it's really not practical. It's not sustainable for the planet for all of us to be going back to that sort of a diet. There's elements of it which I think are useful, and basically, you know, to increase our intake of unprocessed fresh foods and a range of foods, berries and fruits and vegetables and seeds, and maybe, you know, game meat and things like that. There's value in that. But from my understanding, the composition is very similar to the Mediterranean diet. So I think it's a bit of a fad, and it's simply a fad to restrict energy intake. And of course, if you restrict energy intake, you lose weight. So the key messages always comes back to less energy intake, lose weight, move more, be more active.
Michelle?
I think that as dietitians in practice, we need to remember to be working from the evidence. And the evidence we have is on the role of grains and legumes and all the food groups in the modern diet. And we need to rely on that evidence. And that says that 2 to 3 serves of whole grains reduces your risk of chronic disease. High fibre cereal foods reduce your risk of colorectal cancer and is associated with reduced risk of diabetes. So that's the evidence we need to be basing our practice on.
Thank you. And I have a question for Manny. And Manny, how do we address the anti-carb or carbs make you fat messages that are being widely communicated in the media today?
Look, I guess those messages have been around for a long time. I think the hallmark of those messages are the ultimate simplicity of such a message, which is really appealing. You know, it puts foods very much into a black and white category, and that's why they're so popular, because you can just have one scapegoat, which is carbohydrate.
Yes.
And as you know, as nutrition scientists, we know that it's not that simple. You cut out one category of food, and yes, you're cutting out a whole lot of foods that you probably shouldn't be eating, but you're also throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as I mentioned earlier as well, which are important grain foods that are good for bowel health and also for improving body composition, as we've heard.
Yes. Thank you. Jane, question for you, and it's on FODMAPs again. Where does barley sit on the FODMAP scale?
Barley is actually quite high in FODMAPs, in fructan, so that's been
comparable to other grains from your chart?
Well, it's up there really with rye. I'm just trying to think. Rye, it is one of the higher ones, actually. It is quite high, yes. So while it's not great for a patient with IBS, it's fantastic for the general population because it's high and naturally high in a natural prebiotic.
Thank you. And David, how does Barley Max compare then to standard barley?
We've got about, I don't know how many hundred testimonials it is now. We don't actually manufacture the products. We've licensed Barley Max, and that's now, I think, in 18 products. But we've had all these testimonials coming in from people who seem to have IBS or certainly have gut dysfunction saying how much it's helped them. So it may be just the mixture of RS and the other fibre components, including oligosaccharides. Who knows, but they seem to be benefiting from it. But Barley Max has got about, I think it's 30% dietary fibre, so it's a fairly high fibre food product.
Jane, back to you. FODMAPs are certainly creating a number of questions in the audience, which is pleasing to see. So given the important role of FODMAPs as prebiotics, would you recommend taking probiotics or non-grain prebiotic-rich foods during a low FODMAP or gluten-free diet?
That's a really good question, actually. What we tend to recommend is that patients start with one approach at a time, because they often come in and we don't want too many things happening together. We tend to advise them that they start on the low FODMAP diet and then with their dietitian maybe think about introducing a probiotic later. It all depends, you see, they might not need it after they've started the diet. And it's an area that we really need to do more research on. That's actually a really important question. But we generally don't recommend they just start with lots of different things at once. We just have one therapy at a time, because otherwise it's very difficult to know what really is working and what's not working for them.
Thank you. I have time for one other question from the audience in the auditorium, if there is one. No? Michelle, question for you. So given what you've heard about FODMAPs and I guess the gluten-free diet, wheat-free diet scenario and what we've heard from Jane, Manny and David, what's your approach in putting some of the science into practice as a dietitian?
I think, as we've heard this morning on three very big topics in the area of grains and grain foods, if I can tackle the FODMAPs for a start, for dietitians, I think the main message that Jane put across was that for the bulk of people, grain foods are an important part of the diet. If you come across a patient who you think is suffering from IBS, then it's important that they do see an expert in the field and not just initially start off on a low FODMAPs diet, but then in that 6 to 8 week period continue to work with qualified dietitian who's an expert in the field. In terms of weight management, I think the key for us as dietitians is to remember that there is a place for grain foods in the diet, and even on a higher protein diet, there is space. So if you've got patients coming to you saying, oh, I'm giving up breads, I'm giving up pasta, I'm giving up rice, there is room for 2 to 3 serves of grain foods on a higher protein diet. Remember to be choosing the better quality grain foods, the higher fibre, the whole grain foods, but there is still room there. And they are important for digestive health.
Thank you very much. I think with that answer, we will bring the webcast to a close. So thank you very much to our presenters this afternoon, to David, Manny, Jane, and also for Michelle joining the panel. And look, today we've heard there is a lot that we can gain from grains, specifically the role of resistant starch, the new fibre, and that grains can play an important role in weight management as well as in the treatment of IBS, and if we understand FODMAP content. So I do thank you for your contributions. The webcast has been recorded and it will be available for you to access for 6 months. If you go to our website at glnc.org.au, you'll find a link to the webcast and that will be there through till early November. So I do need to take this time to say thank you very much to not only our speakers but to our sponsors. So without our sponsors this event would not have been possible, and I would like to just make mention of CSIRO for the use of the auditorium and their technical facilities here that has enabled us to bring you the webcast, to Campbell Arnott's for their introduction to Intercall, our webcast provider, and also to Goodman Fielder. They've been very generous in their support with the speakers' expenses, and I'm sure you're all aware that David, Manny and Jane have travelled from interstate, so I do thank Goodman Fielder for that support. And with that, I'll bring the webcast to a close, and thank you very much for your attention.